Hello, good afternoon. Thanks for being here. But I don't blame you because it's a very illustrious panel that we have here today, and it's definitely a very interesting topic. The topic is East-West and the rest, that should be us, and how things look from different perspectives at this moment in general, but of course in particularly in this part of the world and Europe. Our panelists are from my extreme right, let's say. Christopher Cocker, LSE, meaning London School of Economics idea, and Professor of International Relations at London School of Economics in the United Kingdom. Next to him, Teresa Fallon, Director, Center for Russia, Europe, Asia Studies in Brussels. Then Alexei Kovalev, Head of Investigation on the platform Medusa.io from the Russian Federation. Then Ambassador Michel Fouché, Chair of Applied Geopolitics at the College of World Studies in France. Peter Zvak, Brigadier General, retired, from the U.S. Army, from the United States. And a special addition to this debate, we will actually have a discussant at the end, somebody who will listen very carefully to what's going on, and then fire a few ideas at us right before we open the floor to the audience to ask questions. This is Tony van der Togt, Associate Senior Research Fellow, Klingendale Institute from the Netherlands. We will spend about an hour listening to the panelists. We will then give 5 minutes to the discussant, and we will then have about 25 minutes for the audience to ask questions and the panelists to respond. Western Balkan states. One of the questions that is often asked is how resilient are they? How resilient they are as states, but also how resilient are the democracies in these countries? And something that I think is important to distinguish, and this is how resilient are societies. Maybe of all the three, societies have the biggest staying power of all. But if I may, I would start with this question or suggestion with Professor Cocker.
Well, I'm not an expert on the Western Balkans, so I'll come clean immediately. But when we hear the word resilience, it means different things to different people. So if psychiatrists are talking about the resilience of their patients, they're talking about their capacity to deal with trauma. If an engineer is dealing with the resilience of a bridge or construction, it's whether it can survive a storm, for example, whether it's still in working condition. So I suppose my definition of resilience would be whether you maintain your core purpose or not. And every state has two core purposes, it seems to me. One is sovereignty, so to maintain its sovereignty within whatever transnational system or structure. We discussed that in the last panel, the extent to which sovereignty means much these days in an interdependent world. The other would be to maintain one's core value system, whatever those values are. And certainly in Europe at the moment, we have challenges, every part of Europe, Western, Eastern, Central, and the Western Balkans, we have challenges to those things. We have challenges to our sovereignty, but particularly with the rise of nationalism and populism, we have challenges to our core value system as well.
In that, we are very often, let's say, reminded that however small this region might be, it actually is, to some extent and sometimes to a great extent, of interest to some great world powers. And sometimes we feel their presence more acutely, we as countries of the region. Sometimes it's not so visible. But maybe we could, and I will here jump over Teresa to go to Nikolai, because I want to start with the traditional great power that's considered controversial, and then go to the new great power that's considered controversial. Traditional great power that's considered controversial is Russia. So how do you see the influence of Russia on the staying power or resilience of democracy of the countries in the region?
Okay, there's several layers to this question. The influence of Russia is the first thing you see when you drive into Belgrade from the airport is a ad for Gazprom, 100 feet tall, hanging from Kulagenex, the tallest tower that is the gate of Belgrade. And a big part of both Russian and Serbian, I think, national myth is how close we are. And the first thing you see is the ad for Gazprom, and then the first thing you hear when you get into Belgrade and you talk to someone and they see you, recognize you as a Russian, you will hear an entire speech on how close we are, our two nations, and how our historical destinies are intertwined, and it can go on and on and on, and often ends up in a cafe over drinks. But then when you actually look closer, you see that the relationship is quite superficial. So we have very deep business ties between Russia and Serbia, for example. And you see Gazprom stations all over Serbia, and then you see Serbian produce in supermarkets in Moscow. But other than that, I think Serbia and other Balkan states, whether they profess their relationship to Russia as something beneficial or not, they are much more, for practical purposes, they are more interested in relations with their neighbors. And Russia is great at long-distance relationships, like Serbia. Like it's great having a friend in Russia when you don't share a common border, like Ukraine just found out 5 years ago. But the closer you get to Russia, the more fraught these relationships get, as sometimes we often see these flare-ups between Russia and Bulgaria, for example. When the government of Bulgaria does something that the Russian government perceives as not as beneficial to their interests, or if there is some obscene graffiti on a Soviet soldier statue in Sofia, and then it goes into these really revisionist historical arguments that I'm often hearing on Russian state television, which I study closely. That Russia, not just the government of Russia, not just the political elite, sees Western Balkan states as its legitimate sphere of influence, and that somehow these states are beholden to Russia. They owe something to Russia for something that happened a few hundred years ago. And these people actually see that as a legitimate argument. Like, how can you get into this deal with anyone else other than Russia when we liberated you like 180 years ago or so the argument goes. So yeah, that's what it mostly gets to. The farther you are from Russia, the better your relationship is. And
May I just add one question to that? It's fine. Except somehow Russia is always used as a counter-argument to democracy, as an alternative to democracy.
There is
Good relations with Russia are used as an alternative to...
They're not mutually exclusive.
I would assume, but... Yeah. And China, Teresa Fallon, this is something that is relatively new in the region. Russia, we've never resolved, but the region knows about it and is more or less used to it. But China is relatively new.
Yes, it is. First of all, I just want to thank everyone. It's my first time in Belgrade, and I'm so honored to be here. When I flew here from Abu Dhabi, my plane was filled with about 90% of the people on the plane were from China. So that came as quite a shock to me, because when I landed in Belgrade, the stewardess, I asked her, are these people part of a tour group? What is it? And she said, this looks like a flight from Shanghai. So it was actually from Abu Dhabi, and this huge influx of Chinese. So this is a big change, I'm sure, for Serbia as well. We always think of Russia in terms of influence activities and investment and power in the region, but China has grown so much in this region that when I speak to Serbian officials, they tell me it's the fourth pillar of their foreign policy. So the sheer speed with which China has emerged as a major economic actor in the region means it also brings with it a lot of power and influence. So I only have a couple of minutes, so I decided to break it down into three things. First, what does China want as a great power? The simple answer is they want supremacy. Now, we all tend to think of, oh, we don't have to worry about them, they're so far away, they're in the Pacific, they just want to push the US out of there. We have no concerns. But China's rise is a global rise because they need to maintain the Chinese Communist Party. So anything that could threaten them is something that they want to protect. So the best Chinese strategy, I would say, is to convince everybody that they had no strategy, especially in Europe. I was recently at a conference in Germany, it was closed-door Chatham House rule, and an official stood up and said, whether you like it or not, China is a power, an accidental power in Europe. So the key word there was accidental, because nothing is by design, it's all by accident. But I would say that some of you might have noticed how far and how fast they've risen isn't by accident, it really is a carefully thought out plan. And just like the rest of us, they know where they want to go, they make mistakes, but they have a direction of travel that they want to go, and they do it by experimentation. So, second, so as I said, not Russia, but China. And I believe that China poses a longer-term strategic challenge in the region, and Russia has actually been kind of distracting everybody from what China's really doing. European Commissioner for European Neighborhood Policy and Enlargement Negotiations, Johannes Hahn, underlined that in Brussels. He stated that the EU has overestimated Russia and underestimated China in the Balkans. And they're also, very concerned in Brussels about the type of debt that Balkan countries are taking on. And third, the 17+1. So this predates the China's Belt and Road Initiative, but it's all part of the long strategic narrative of Belt and Road. 17+1 are 11 EU member states, 5 possible accession states, and then Greece was added in April of this year. So just by accident, China has a land-sea corridor right between Europe and Russia. It's absolutely amazing, and it was all completely by accident. So what should we think about the Belt and Road Initiative? Well, some people have described it as Serbia plus the rest, and Serbia seems to be the key country where China has invested. It's also a big recipient of EU grants. So Serbia has received a lot of money from the EU and their grants, whereas China has given loans. But maybe the EU needs to actually advertise that more, because a great deal has been put here. And there is no such thing as strings attached. It might not seem that way at the beginning, but later these loans might also be a form of leverage that China can use. So there's something I call the China-Balkan paradox. So China's presence in the Balkans is paradoxical in that it tends to undermine the very stability on which the Belt and Road Initiative depends. Chinese advance is possible in Balkans because it is the EU which guarantees the region's political stability and long-term viability. And high-quality rules and reform demands connected with EU funding allows China a low-cost strategy of underbidding EU offers. So the EU needs to, take up the challenge. And fourth, united front work. So this is kind of an old Soviet term that Mao called magic weapon. And it's kind of, going back to the old-fashioned influence activities. And China is very, very good at this. We had Xi Jinping's visit here to Belgrade. He visited the Chinese embassy, laid a stone, opened a Confucius Institute. One of the biggest cultural centers is being built here. And the Confucius Institutes, of course, give Chinese language training, but it's also a type of training that, for example, the 3 Ts, you can never talk about Taiwan, Tibet, or Tiananmen. So all these things come with strings. And also there's a large China diaspora here. So the Chinese try to use that also as part of their influence operations. So to close, strategic vigilance is required. China's chilling use of digital surveillance paints a picture of an increasingly shuttered world that runs on conspicuous Chinese coercion. I know it sounds great, right? Smart city sounds wonderful, but it's almost Orwellian. We see what's happening in Xinjiang, and that's going to be rolled out to the rest of China, but we're also seeing that here in Serbia. We have China's police here helping to train others how to use this surveillance system. And we've also seen China's economic coercion just recently with the National Basketball Association. One tweet which was quickly deleted changed a multi-billion-dollar industry. They're no longer allowed to stream television, sell things in China, so it has a huge economic cost. We've seen that with Mercedes-Benz with a tweet. We've also seen airlines like United Airlines listing Taiwan as a separate country. All these businesses have been penalized if they don't follow the PRC line. Okay, and then lastly, longer-term thinking is needed to meet the China challenge. So Serbia still has agency. Leaders and citizens need to exercise strategic vigilance because never before has an authoritarian regime had at its disposal such powerful tools of technological tyranny. And what are the... Okay, and then finally...
I will give you the floor again, so you'll have a chance. But now we've heard... some comments about Russia and China from Alexia and Teresa. Michel Fouché, there are other potentially big players, such as the US, such as the EU, and such as a regional big player wannabe is Turkey. Also, these first two big players, how do they interact, or how do they, you think, influence, or at least some of them influence the actual developments both of institutions and state building in this region?
Yes, my point is more on geopolitics and foreign diplomacy than internal political situation. You remind a remark made in March by Johannes Hahn, EU Commissioner for Negotiation of Enlargement. He told some weeks before the 17 plus 1, or better said 1 plus 17, Dubrovnik meeting, maybe we have overestimated Russia, underestimated China. So the EU perspective has to take into account the role of other actors. Of course, it's a leverage to Brussels, obviously. Everybody is using that, diaspora, government. The shortfall is that we are putting all the countries of the Western Balkans in the same basket, geopolitical vacuum, which is supposed to be that. I think Russia's interest for the region is mainly to stop NATO enlargement, which is going on. So the next objective is to stop NATO enlargement in Serbia and Bosnia and Herzegovina. So I don't believe that the US are completely out of the game. At least the Pentagon. When I was in charge of failed negotiations, the Rambouillet process, I was at the core of that. We were very active to propose a substantial autonomy for Kosovo. I have to come back to that. Sonia knows that very well. We fell with the French, with the German and the Brits. Why? Because we ignore a very important point. It was the objective of the Pentagon to have the second military basis today, Bonstil, close to Pristina. We were not informed of that. This was not acceptable. So I don't think the Pentagon, military establishment in the US, have forgotten the region. Absolutely not. Absolutely not. We cannot stay only to the next tweet, or the last one. Second point, China is a shock. You remember just Dubrovnik meeting, inauguration of the bridge in Croatia. This bridge had a cost of 420 million euro, paid by 89% by European taxpayer under structural fund in favor of a Chinese company. The workforce was exclusively Chinese, living on a boat anchored offshore. So there is a problem today in pre-enlargement strategy on specific rules or lack of rules for tender. So we have to reform that first. I will come back to the second question on EU and the Balkans in the context of the recent decision. So this is I think this is a problem, for the EU. We cannot accept this kind of situation. And maybe we can wonder which network was powerful enough for the Commission to accept this financing after having refused to do so several years earlier. There is no example of foreign creditor not be tempted at the end of the day to demand a political return for its support. Huawei will have in Belgrade an innovation center with 3 smart city projects: Novi Sad, Niš, starting with Novi Sad, Niš, and Belgrade. It's just the beginning of something. Is it about safe city or surveillance, like in China? So China is challenging for the region and also for the EU as such. And our view, at least in France, but it's not an official view, you will have an official view tomorrow morning with the former French ambassador to Serbia, so please don't blame on me. We have to reform many things within the EU before being able to enlarge. We cannot enlarge with the present situation in the EU itself, starting with the Commission. How many commissioners at the end of the day to do what? We have to reform the EU. This is the present point, and I think external challenges are maybe useful for us to be more efficient. There is a kind of bureaucracy producing. We open chapters and we never close the chapters. I will stop with one remark. When the question of accession of Central Europe and Baltic Europe was raised in 1993, European Council of Copenhagen, new criteria were drawn. Rule of law, democracy, market economy. It was Montesquieu and market economy. Why? Because enlargement was directed to countries with a past, a Soviet past. We had no Copenhagen criteria in 1957. During the Rome Treaty, we had other criteria. So I think when I talk about criteria, it's not to block, it's really to adapt the offer of the EU to the real challenges, which are basically political reconciliation, etc. And my last point is that I wrote extensively on that. We are giving too much money to Visegrad countries or in Bulgaria, and not enough money. Look at Serbia and Bulgaria, the same population, the same needs. Close to 12 billion euro for Bulgaria, being a member state, 1.5 to Serbia. We have to change that. So this is not the point of enlargement as such. Enlargement is not a formal issue. It's really a very comprehensive issue, and we have to change that before. We had to change the bureaucracy of the Union before, going further to really address the real concern of the specific region after 20 years of tragedies, of difficulties.
Thank you. Man, this sounds really scary, because if we have to change the structures of the European Union before these guys can enter, Peter Zuck, does America care?
Oh, thank you for that. That's the best, easiest question. Of course it cares. It's how. First of all, I just came out of the U.S. government after 38 years. These are my own views. The United States cares. It cares a lot. But it is also, my country has a lot going on around the world right now. We invested heavily into this region. Certainly in the post-UNPRO 4 Dayton period, I4, S4, K4, and we're still here in Kosovo. Excuse me, forgive me. We're still here in Serbia. In Kosovo, and we have, I think, built good links with Serbia. And I think we have mostly gotten past the very difficult period of 1999. Where we go from here is the question. You saw our Ambassador Grenell come in after the elections in Kosovo. That is a obvious sign of interest and focus. We are also, however, engaged in conflicts in Afghanistan, in Iraq, Syria, and posted a lot of other places in the world. So after getting established in K4, yes, we did pull back our presence somewhat. For safe and secure, yes, we did keep Camp Bondsteel at the welcoming of the Kosovar government. And that is a very small, modest platform compared to what it used to be. But we're here. In the end, by making our major effort at the end of it was sort of the beginning of the new era after the Cold War. I'd like to think that we were able to enable and to assist Europe in providing the stability that the region so desperately needs in order to enhance, if you will, or to enable the resilience of the peoples in this very, very complicated, proud, but also fractious region. So yes, we're still very, very involved, but we have a lot going on.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Christopher Cochran. Are some of the things that Michel Fouché mentioned, are those some of the reasons you think that caused the Brexit decision, or that caused Britain to say, we've had it?
I was very much hoping that we wouldn't have a Brexit question, because
sorry,
quite frankly, I've come a long way to avoid that. nobody has a clue what's going to happen 24 hours later, in fact, even 12 hours later. So I don't think it's a very useful question, quite frankly.
Okay, but I thought that maybe reforms were something that Britain thought was useful. But if you don't like this question, I can ask you another one, and this is: in the absence of Europe, in the absence of a clear position that Europe is taking a proactive policy towards the region, do you think that maybe opens this space for populists, for something that has been in vogue in politics globally, let's say recently, but surprisingly little considering the problems that we as countries of the region, regardless whether we are members of the EU or not, have? Relatively little, comparatively little here. But if Europe pulls back or takes some time for reflection, as this is called, what is the alternative? What comes instead of it?
Slightly sidestep that question as well, and just give you a somewhat different answer, but I think the answer is included in the answer to your question is included in the one that I've decided to ask myself, and that is, why has Europe been caught out by events so much? We are in the 30th anniversary of the fall of the Berlin Wall, which was a European event. The Cold War was a European war. I know it was fought off in different theatres of the world, but the centre of the Cold War was the Berlin Wall, was the inter-German border, was the fact that Europe was going to be the main battlefield. And when we look at it, we realize that this was a historical turning point, but as an English historian famously said about another historical turning point, it failed to turn. It failed to actually deliver the world that we hoped for. We hoped, for example, that Russia would become part of the West. And Richard Nixon went to his death a few years later saying, who lost to Russia? Well, of course, Russia was never there to gain, but people actually actively thought that it would be. People thought that this part of the world would be westernized pretty quickly, together with Eastern Europe when they joined. People thought that we had seen the end of history, that basically the liberal democratic order was going to extend and was going to be consolidated. And people, surprising though it is, when you're looking back, thought that somehow we were going to be in a much better situation historically. Do you remember the preamble to the European Security Strategy of 2003? Europe has never been safer, was the word. Well, we're looking back today, I would say Europe has never been quite as badly placed as it is in living memory, and we're living in the most dangerous neighbourhood in the world at the moment. That may change. The real turning point, which Europe ignored, was 1979, where you had two major events. One was the opening of the markets in China, which took China from being an economy the size of the District of Columbia in the early 70s to being just behind the United States today. And the other was the Islamic revolution in Iran, which has fundamentally changed the face of the Middle East, created an Islamic problematique, I don't use the word problem, for Europe at its very heart, both externally and internally. And I think we're now realizing that historically we took our eye off that particular ball because we were so quite understandably preoccupied with the end of the Cold War and the triumph of the West, as it was often called. We're catching up now. Just to finish on this note, I remember when Princess Diana was interviewed in that famous interview before the divorce proceedings against Prince Charles, and she said there were three in this relationship, you know. She was referring to his present wife. Back in 1999, when we fought the Kosovo War, there were only three in the relationship: the United States, the European Union, and Russia. Today there are 8 countries in that relationship, of which China happens to be at the top. Turkey is there, Qatar is there, Saudi Arabia is there, and one or two others as well. So this has no longer become a European backyard, as we used to think it is, or even part of the European Union's near abroad, to use a favourite Russian term. It's a very crowded space, and there are a lot of players with completely different agendas from those of the United States or the European Union, for that matter.
Thank you very much. There's a fellow that can see you want to comment on this.
On Professor Coker's comment about Nixon on his deathbed, he also said, in regard to China, have we created a Frankenstein? So those were his last words, or supposedly his last words. It's very dramatic. So I agree with your comments, especially the EU thought of themselves as a postmodern, so they didn't want to get out of their postmodern garden. They didn't do geopolitics, and then geopolitics has come back fiercely right in their neighborhood, let alone worrying about China at a long distance. The accession of the People's Republic of China to the World Trade Organization was a monumental event for them. Their economy grew far more dramatically than 1979 when they, under Deng Xiaoping, opening up the markets. So I think the idea that China, if we grasp them close enough to us, hug them close to us, they'll be just like us, I think that strategy has been retired. And I think that instead of having them become a democracy and opening their markets and expecting reciprocity, we see that the West has actually built up an authoritarian regime that's very rich. So this is a huge problem for us. And as Professor Coker mentioned, this is the 30th anniversary of the fall of the Berlin Wall, but we also forget the mirror image of that. It's also the 30th anniversary of the Tiananmen Square massacre. So another part of the world with a huge population had a very different approach. And with their leaked document number 9, the biggest threat to the Chinese Communist Party are universal values, democracy, all these liberal ideas. So they're going to work all over the world to try to undermine that. And I think we need to keep our eye on the ball.
Thanks. Alexei Kovalev, countries in this region use and used the EU accession process not only as a strategy to join the European Union, but actually as a state-building exercise. The relationships with other big powers, if we may call European Union a big power, the relationships with other big powers were not focused on that aspect. But they might become focused on that aspect. And if we look at these relationships from that perspective, that a relationship with China could also be a state-building exercise, only of a different state, or the relationship with Russia, which is more likely or more sort of imaginable, let's say, could also be a state-building exercise, only of a different state and a different government. And this is why I think this presence and active presence of the European Union is so important. But at the same time, Russia can also say, well, we have another model.
Okay, so from where I sit, from where I normally sit in Moscow, EU accession is more of a bargaining chip. That's what it looks like from Moscow. So whenever someone we consider a natural ally, like Serbia, or someone closer, like Belarus, puts forward some terms we don't like you don't want to give us a discount on your gas. Okay, so we'll consider the EU accession next. And that's what it looks like from Moscow. Not much of a threat in terms of a state building prospect, but as a political bargaining chip. As far as the state building goes, Russia's problem is that it doesn't really have much of an ideology to offer. Like, we don't really have anything tangible. Like, China has resources and technological advancement to offer, and EU is just physically closer. And Russia can offer its market, but it's not very, it's not very lucrative. Russia is a relatively small economy, really. So in terms of state building exercises, the signs I would suggest to look out for, and that's what I'm seeing on the ground in Russia. What is happening is that, for example, when Chinese state media strike an agreement with a certain country's state media, and it's never on the host country's terms. So, for example, what's happening in Russia now, and that I can see actually, the signs are here, is that we are actually the Chinese, the creeping censorship is happening while everyone is either not seeing it or trying to look the other way. And that is a state-building exercise when taking over. Well, that's what it is in essence. A silent, not necessarily hostile, or it doesn't appear so, but it's a slow and silent, but very. You'll know it when you see it. It's a takeover of media resources, and that's a very definite state-building exercise, because yeah, you'll know it when you'll see it, but you better look out for the signs.
Thanks. I completely agree, I must say. Michel Fouché. It seems like the alternative is liberal democracy or populism. But populism is just a more polite word for different types of autocracy. In this part of the world, I would say that European Union equals, and being part of the process, equals building a liberal democracy. And populism equals, failing that, we'll have these really autocratic guys that will capture the state. And I think we are faced with this alternative. What do you think?
Yes. It's difficult to define populism. There are debates between political scientists. Is it an ideology or a style? If we look at Salvini, which is a good example, is basically a style of permanent communication. He never came to his office as a Minister of Finance. He was always talking to people and making communications to his electorate. And I think the link between risk of populism and lagging enlargement is not the correct one, because we unfortunately are facing this risk also in consolidated liberal democracies even in Western Europe, even in London. I'm very sad to look at what is happening in the British Parliament. I don't recognize the roots of my kind of democracy. But the risk is there. Social media are perturbing, are disturbing normal rules. It is becoming more difficult to discuss on facts, established truth. This is well known, but this is a challenge facing also the EU. Well, at the same time, Western Balkans are already part of the economic European sphere. 75% of the trade is with the EU, not with Russia, 7%, even with China, 8%. This will not change, some light changes. So this is already done. Negotiations are underway. Pre-enlargement programs are functioning. And the last EU-Balkan summit in Sofia in May last year proposed 6 leading initiatives. Some of them are more political than economic. Rule of law, which is a safeguard against populism, tending to shortcut institutions. An expert for Salvini has no say because he is not elected. So I'm an expert. I cannot talk because I'm not elected. Okay? So rule of law, security, this is 6 lines of action. Good neighborly behavior and reconciliation, which is the main issue here, not in Poland or in the Baltic states. Economic and digital development and connectivity, which is very good for Chinese interest. So this is initiatives endorsed by the European Council in June 2008 and 18, and we have to try to implement that, which is not, it's really a huge program, which seems closer to the needs of the population, the society of your region. After that, on the EU enlargement, I would like you to understand that we are allowed to also, as founding members, to have a view about the EU today. We need an EU working better. The old debate between enlargement and deepening was decided in favor of enlargement. But we need an EU working better. For example, too many matters are submitted to unanimity, starting with fiscal issues. Okay? So when France proposed to have taxation on GAFA, this is not possible because Ireland is against. So we are proposing more qualified majority. The same story for defense and security, for migration. So we need to change the rules, the decision-making process within the EU itself. And that's why I think French officials tend to think that today, EU as it is working, is not ready to absorb new members. This is an analysis you can criticize, but please, I ask you 1 minute to try to understand our side. But we are not away from the region. I think the French president made a very important visit and knows there is a renewed interest for the region in France, which is a good thing. But we have to understand that deepening enlargement is a permanent debate. It was so in the last 30 years.
Thank you very much. One, however, could argue that two are not necessarily contradictory, and that Western Balkan countries are not asking to become members. They're asking to start negotiating. And this is like 10 years, maybe more. Some countries that are negotiating are asking to make progress, not on merit, absolutely on merit. But you can argue that, but you can also argue that there is a lot of difficulty within European Union, especially consensus building with this decision-making process. So that also is something that simply has to be taken into consideration. You cannot ignore it.
May I? You know very
Absolutely.
well that more than 20 years ago, when Jacques Delors came to former Yugoslavia to propose a specific EU program, the answer was negative.
This was 30 years ago.
30 years ago, yes.
And
no,
this
okay,
was
but
when there's one
after
country.
that you have other priorities.
This was a very different time, and it was actually a proposal to a different country that doesn't exist anymore. Part of the sort of, let's say, social dissatisfaction, part of the way society expresses its dissatisfaction with the slowness of the process or confusion that we are facing, not only in this region, I think in general, but obviously also in this region, has very often been called the struggle against the elites. So, do you think that this is a legitimate description of the society's reaction to, let's say, dysfunctionality or perceived dysfunctionality or slowness of the institutions? Peter Zwak.
Struggle versus the elites. First of all, just the statement is a us against them statement, from my perspective, which feeds into, if you will, the more exaggerated forms of populism, the more malign, however definition you'd want to use that. And clearly, and while there's always been conflict and class struggle and all the definitions we know in political science classes, there seems to be an increasing echelonment of wealth and access and privilege in the world today, which has led to some, I think, in part, of these movements that you see with the illiberal democracies so-called here, or within Russia, or even in my country with the so-called base. And this is going to be a problem, I think, as these issues are seized upon, and then you have media that is linked to different talking points and advocacies. In my country, I worry about that it's very, very difficult to see straight news anymore. It's all opinion news. And that feeds, when you get into creating gaps and rifts in society, is dangerous. In this cyber-enabled world today, which is a big difference than 20 years ago, information and news moves much faster. I mean, speed of light fast almost. And both good news gets out, and then lies get out, and misinformation get out. And if they're not dealt with in a few hours, that is fact. I think that feeds into this broader picture. I think we've got to get much deeper into the issues on inequality than to just call it. It feeds into it. It leads into a lot of the problems today. It leads into a lot of the rhetoric today. It feeds beautifully into the narratives, if you will, of the so-called liberal democracies and things like that, and authoritarian states. And it's something that we're going to have to really work with. And the final point is, you mentioned earlier, you've got these large platforms, whether it's Facebook or LinkedIn or Twitter, and these things also build, if you will, polarization, which I think is at the heart now, increasingly, of however people identify or not with inequality out there in the world today.
Thank you. Let me just ask a follow-up question, and if I may go again to the beginning of the lineup to Christopher Cocker. I would sort of make let's say, a statement or possibly an interpretation of sort of a weird perception of security or threats to security in southeastern Europe. On one level, the countries of the region perceived the threats to their security almost exclusively as threats to each other. As, you know, being afraid of the neighbors, and you have to sort of make sure to protect yourself from the neighbors. At the same time, I think one could maybe argue that this is a region relatively wide open to cyber insecurity or to cyber attacks, because everybody is so focused on their neighbors that nobody is really looking on influences that can change your results of the elections, your complete outlook. So, please.
There's a mixture of the past and the future, isn't there? Or perhaps the past and the present. I mean, obviously, some of these countries have unresolved historical disputes. They may have been resolved at the diplomatic level, but they're certainly not resolved in the popular mind. Hungary, after all, has just built this enormous fence, not just, but it is one of the biggest, if you want to call it, set of fortifications against its neighbors. On the other hand, there are the so-called frontline states, and those countries that border Russia or consider themselves to be directly at threat from Russia. A country like Hungary, or the president, I say president of the Czech Republic, does not share that view, far from it, but that is a widely perceived perception. If it wasn't for Russia, in fact, there might be even greater dissension between neighboring states. There's a kind of link which is now developing between the Baltic and the Black Sea, on the understanding that if the Russians put pressure in one area and there's a pushback, they may put pressure in another. So these are new axes or alignments which are coming about. But you're quite right, cyber attacks are a reality. Just ask the Ukraine that has been attacked several times by Russia. Or look at Estonia, of course, which perhaps fought the first cyber war in 2007. When you can't go to get your money out on a Monday morning from the ATM machine, or when your links with the internet have been cut off, that, I think, in a sense, clarifies the cyber threat in a way that other cyber issues, cyber episodes haven't. So this is, I think, a country which is half looking to the past and is half, of course, living already perhaps in the future.
Alexei, I will ask you first. Is Russia interested?
Can I say a few words about...
Sure, absolutely.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
Can I say a few words about populism? Yeah, just give me a minute.
Sure.
I have good news for you, ladies and gentlemen, because coming from a country whose president's entire claim to legitimacy rests on the assumption that he is for the common people. He liberated them from the rule of the corrupt elite, from the oligarchs. But this claim, it really has a shelf life. It can only last a generation because people, a few millions of Russians who have just turned 19 this year, they lived their entire life with this president. So when they hear this argument, like, but we saved you from the corrupt elite in the 90s, it doesn't mean anything to them. It's just irrelevant. So the central claim of populism, it really doesn't last longer than one generation. Is Russia interested? Well, it can be interested in many things, but well, let's
cyber influencing the region.
Yeah, but it can be interested in a lot of things. But let's face it, we just don't have the resources. I mean, as an investigative journalist, I've spent a lot of time investigating the cybercrime in Russia and cyber offense capabilities, and it's really not that much. I mean, I'll put it bluntly, it's really not that much. Because we simply don't have that many weaponized hackers, because there are so many people in Russia. And I'd say, I'd be much more worried about China, for example, for the sheer amount of resources that China has, including that specific area.
It's interesting because this is the big question everyone's always asking: will Russia and China cooperate on these type of cyber? And as far as I've seen, I haven't seen a lot of cooperation. Russia is considered very, very good at it, but the Chinese have poured a lot of money into CGTN, their international television network. China Daily, every hotel, this hotel included, I believe, has a China Daily in the lobby. Confucius Institutes associated with universities, so that they're kind of shaping the next generation of people and how they're thinking about the future. And China is pouring a lot of money into this, so they're trying to make it a success. In regard to what we call preemptive obedience, countries and people behaving in a certain way so as not to upset China. I mean, we saw this with Norway, for example, when Liu Xiaobo was awarded the Nobel Peace Prize. And the only other person who was in custody who won the Nobel Peace Prize was a German who died in prison as well, like Liu Xiaobo. So instead of trying to punish the Nobel Prize Committee, they decided to punish the Norwegian government, and for 6 years they were put on the naughty step. So what happened? What did other countries in Europe do? Can you think of one leader in Europe now who meets with the Dalai Lama? I can't think of anybody. And so, China...
Czech Republic.
Zaman meets with the Dalai Lama? No, he doesn't. So Havel had a great example, but that's almost the past. But Czech Republic, there is a lot of pushback there, which I think is very, very good. So I think China really has, we don't really see it. They do it very slowly, and it's one German intelligence officer described it as the boiling frog syndrome. So you have, the frog doesn't know that it's being boiled in a pot. So that's where we are now. We don't feel the temperature rising, but eventually we're just going to burst from being boiled in a boiling pot of water. So the cyber espionage, the Chinese have been very, very good and skillful at that. So they're standing on the shoulders of giants. They've stolen a lot of technology, but they're also very smart people who've gone to some of the best universities in the world, and they're developing and innovating newer technology.
We have 1 minute per person.
Okay.
No. Sorry, but thanks a lot. I just want to give the floor to Michel Fouché and to Peter Zwack to sort of for their closing comments in this part, and then of course they will answer questions. Michel Fouché.
Yes, there is one point. I don't know if it's about security. It's more about political change, because this is something we observe not only in Germany, Austria, Switzerland also, Belgium, but in France. I gave a speech recently in a small city in northeastern France for International Festival of Geography. Many people are coming. I had to drive 40 kilometers to find a hotel because 3 hotels of the city were occupied by people from Albania asking for asylum. As far as I know, Albania is not exactly in the same situation of Syria. So I started to look at figures. 5% of the population of Bosnia-Herzegovina left the country in the last 5 years. 2% every year from Kosovo, between brackets for me, Kosovo, and from Albania, 2.2. What does it mean? Poor economy, less pressure for change, and more control of democratic institutions by clans and parties. I read recently a good paper by our friend Ivan Krastev about migration from Bulgaria. Why to migrate, by the way, when you are a member of the EU in Bulgaria? And the answer is very clear for him. If I understand, I'm young, I have diploma, I want to work for my country within the European framework. If at one point I have to conclude that I cannot change the system, I make the only decision I can do myself, I leave. And I think this will have long-term effect, not on security itself, in classical sense of the word, but of the capacity of these countries, or new countries, to promote political change. And if you refuse my argument about enlargement, look at the report, a yearly report of the EU Commission about the progress of rule of law. Just one short quotation about Montenegro, the last EU report of the Commission. It's a fantastic diplomatic wording. It's vital for the rule of law to produce more tangible and sustainable result. Okay? I let you interpret that. So, for me, it's an important issue, even if some host country, Germany, Austria, France, maybe, Sweden, are benefiting from migrants. I'm not sure they will come back until there is no political change. So, and if you have that kind of report in the European Council, some countries are reluctant. What about the rule of law? But people are not waiting for that, they are leaving. And they are right to do that.
Yeah. Peter Zwack, just if you can comment, you can say, of course, what you feel you need to say, but something that has also come out of this debate and has been present a lot lately in politics is this division to us and them, and confronting who is us with our definition of who is them. Maybe you want to comment on that. If not, comment on what you feel like commenting on.
Again, thank you. Stay with me here, okay? I'm processing. I'm going to give a few seconds. I started out in 1980 as a young, brand new second lieutenant in an artillery battalion with a mission to line up opposite the Fulda Gap in West Germany and fire, if need be, nuclear rounds at the invading Warsaw Pact. We never want to go back to that. I worry, however, that a lot is going on in the world, that the polarization, the troubles with dialogue, and then with the U.S. and Russia, I think that we just simply don't talk past each other. Pay attention to one of the big stories for 2020 will be arms control, and that affects all of us in this room, is withered. We talked about community this morning in the panels, and the erosion of key international governance elements. There's a lot to worry about, but I want to try to end on a positive note here. How many of you were adults, 18-year-olds or older in 1991 with the fall of the wall? About half the audience. Then I want to remind that, and then I want to talk for context to the younger people out here. It took inspired leadership by both sides, whether it was at the end of defeating the Nazis and the dealing with the potential fragmentation of Europe, which happened. Then you had the Cold War for 40 years, and there was inspired European, American, Soviet leadership that got us out of the Cold War, and and that was probably a societal bullet that we dodged, that let's hope never comes back. And then what else happens? And for the United States, of course, 2014 is a major deal because we're now working with Europe to try to limit the threats and everything else in Europe and elsewhere. There's a lot to worry about, but what you're doing mostly here with the Forum of the European Union to try to bring first peace and prosperity to the Western Balkans is critical. It's all part of a world that desperately, in my mind, needs stability and this type of far-sighted action. I know the United States is all in on this, both philosophically and provides aid, but you're the lead on this. We're working with many of the allies here on NATO to try to provide that protective thing. We've got to find a bridge to the Russians. It's not zero sum. We got to find a way to the Russians, and we also have to figure out how to manage the East. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I think that it's a wonderful thing to end the panel's presentations or discussion with the notion of inspired leadership. In order to do anything, you need inspired leadership. So, Tony van der Togt, what do you think of it?
Thank you very much. I think we are still clearly in need of inspiring leadership right now. First, thanks to the organizers for having me. I think this is a very interesting discussion and it comes at the right moment. I think what is very much at stake here is the challenges to what we always consider to be the multilateral rules-based order and our place as EU in it. And like some of the speakers already mentioned, I mean, we thought that we could leave geopolitics out of it. EU was not doing geopolitics. Well, geopolitics is back with a vengeance, and like Ursula von der Leyen has been saying, this is going to be a geopolitical commission. So maybe some inspiring leadership will come from that side. I hope so. This all has been against the background of geopolitical shifts taking place, shifts in power relations. And we cannot automatically think that the EU is still the shining example for other countries to follow, like we considered ourselves to be in the past. And also with the US. I mean, yes, the US is still very much involved here, but we are not always sure that the EU and the US are on the same page like it was before, like after the fall of the wall, like during the crisis in Yugoslavia. Sometimes I'm trying to find out, well, who makes policy in Washington nowadays? What are policies coming out of Washington? Two questions, or two elements which are constantly part of the debate. One, I will come back to that, is resilience. How can the EU support countries to deal with internal, external challenges? The other thing, which was only implicitly mentioned, is connectivity. And connectivity, of course, relates very much to the challenge which China is posing now with the Belt and Road Initiative, and to which the EU is trying to answer with its own connectivity strategy. Connectivity in itself is great. I mean, if you have more exchanges, business, people to people, in the infosphere, it's all very nice. But connectivity on which basis? So what are the norms and standards on which this connectivity is based? And that's, I think, the main challenge from China nowadays. So the challenge of China is not only the debt trap, it's also not taking into account certain standards, even technical norms and standards, or standards connected to environment, which the Chinese are not respecting. And developing new standards in areas where we didn't have common international or European standards before, like in the information sphere. Look at Huawei, look at 5G, this type of discussion. Russia, yes, I mean, Russia has historical, cultural connections with this region, but frankly speaking, I mean, I looked as a researcher more into what Eurasian Economic Union may mean, and I don't see very much in it for countries in this region. You can have a free trade agreement, but what will the added value be? So to me, it's indeed, China is much more of a competitor, a challenge here, based on this divergence of norms and standards, or potential divergence of norms and standards than Russia. And yes, when we are talking about resilience, yes, we are also addressing what you said about elites. Because yes, there could be a problem with elites, and in different countries it plays out in a different way. But you can have state capture. You can have elites dominating the media, and that has serious consequences. You can have governments officially proclaiming pro-European, pro-EU policies. But what does it mean in practice? Very often the real pro-European forces can be found elsewhere in society. And the EU should take that somehow into account and should be clear to authorities, I think. And that goes by way of conditionality. It should be strict on this conditionality that, okay, if you want to join the club, you have to play according to those rules. And those rules, and we should remain credible. Because that's the point I have about accession or opening, two more points. Opening negotiations for accession. I mean, personally, that's my personal view. I mean, the real point which is at stake here is credibility of the EU. And we should not be seen as moving the goalpost during the football match. So I think that doesn't really help. And okay, we need time to reform the EU, but negotiations will take, 10, 15, 20 years to be concluded. And only then we'll cross that other bridge. And we may not have the time to wait that long. because Europe is also, and has always been, also a peace project to assist countries to overcome, this is the last point, to overcome internal differences and also differences, conflicts with neighbors. And if the project cannot be carried on, this can give rise to, and there we come to the element of populism, to the rise of extreme nationalism, the rise of, indeed, the growing othering, to go into these identity wars, to see the other as the enemy, or some groups in individual societies. So I think this should be overcome. EU could help, but the EU should act credibly and show leadership.
Thank you very much. Thank you to the panel and the discussant. The floor is yours. Comments, questions, madam, in the first row. Yeah, there is a lady coming with a mic.
Hi, I'm Rebecca Fabrizi. I'm Deputy Head of Mission at the British Embassy, but I don't want to talk about the UK today. My observation from being in Serbia for a while is that there is quite an urgent need for more extensive and informed and critical debate about what all of these actors are doing here in Serbia and the region, certainly China, the Gulf countries, and even Russia. Whereas there is much more debate about the European Union here, much more informed debate about that, and also the US. But I'm interested in your observations about whether these different countries are cooperating, or whether they also perceive themselves as competing with each other, or whether they only look at themselves as acting against sort of the European Union in this region, or whether they sort of ignore those issues themselves. So I would be really interested in knowing how you observe that. We've talked quite a lot, I think, recently about cooperation between Russia and China in many areas, but not really cooperation in foreign policy. So I'd
Is
be
there
interested to know
somebody
what you
specific
think.
you would like to comment?
Well, I guess I'm looking at Alexei and Teresa particularly because I'm talking about Russia and China, but other observations, if anybody would like to make them. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you very much. Russia and China, maybe two more. The lady in the first row here, and then the lady with the pink scarf, white scarf.
Abusing the right of co-organizer, Sonja Stojanović-Gajić. I have two quick questions for Mr. Cocker. I know your big topic is war, and the topic of this panel is overcoming great power competition. So I'm curious if you see a potential for overcoming distrust among the big powers today, not in this region, but globally, and what are scenarios of war that you could imagine, or triggers for war that you can imagine. And if I can just brief interaction with Mr. Fuscher, I think we all agree here in the room that business as usual is not delivering on enlargement. But I would dare you to explain how freezing accession process of the Western Balkans will improve rule of law, security that you mentioned, and what are the scenarios that you have in mind at the time frame that would address this issue, because I'm really worried about scenarios of the let's deal first with our internal affairs and let you deal with your own mess on your own. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And the third question, or fourth question.
Thank you. Patricia Hamicka, Warsaw Security Forum. I'm from Poland, so I'll not comment on the rule of law, but I just wanted to make a comment. If we are taking in account the resilience, we should take it into the comprehensive point of view. If we're talking about InfoWars or information warfare, and we're only taking into account the Russian information warfare, not talking about the Chinese influence on this, we are not taking the comprehensive approach. If we are talking about any kind of resilience, we need to talk about Chinese take over of the critical infrastructure in the European Union, which the European Union is not doing a lot about, let's be honest. And I just wanted to hear the panel views on that. How can we have this comprehensive approach on this issue?
Thank you. Maybe Teresa Fallon, on external actors? What are they doing?
Okay, that's an excellent question. I think the 17+1 must be a huge sticking point because it's traditionally Russia's backyard, and then you have China's influence. And whenever I interview Russians about this, they tell me we have bigger fish to fry. They don't really identify that area. They're thinking bigger picture, but I think that this is a very serious question for them because it's not just this new strategic corridor between in an area that has countries that aren't really with deep roots in democracy, for example, and it's a traditional area that it's kind of between Russia and Europe. So I think that this is China's kind of strategic thinking in terms of Go. It's a traditional game where you move around the board, so it's a way to actually kind of control Russia and Europe. So it's a really clever strategy. And in addition, you see 15% of European ports are controlled by China. And that's a huge dramatic change. 60 ports in South America. I mean, they have this long-term thinking in the region. To follow up on your question about a comprehensive approach, I mean, we see China doing lawfare, for example, training European lawyers to interpret international law according to China's lens. The United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea. I've seen many, many lawyers trained in Beijing and Hainan, a beautiful island, to kind of see the world the way China does. So this has a long-term implication. Political warfare, information warfare, China is there all the time doing it. So I think that people really need to pay attention to that. And lastly, we thought economic growth and technology would liberate China. Instead, it corrupted us. And China is changing us more than we are changing China.
Christopher Cochran.
Of these questions. First, the China-Russia connection. This is the thing that keeps people like Henry Kissinger awake at night, because the United States has not the power to deal with that combination of countries. They are not in an alliance yet. They're not even really aligned yet, but Dmitry Trenin talks about an entente between the two, which falls far short of a military alliance. We have to engage Russia and bring it back into the European diplomatic system. And that's very difficult because they have a political leader at the moment that many people mistakenly think he's a strategist. He's not. He's got himself stuck both in Ukraine and Crimea. He's a tactician. He's an opportunist who seizes the opportunities that we in many cases present him with and others present him with. But we have to engage. It is not in Russia's interest to become a satellite of China. And Russians know that. But at the moment, no one's investing in the Russian economy because of sanctions, and the Chinese have invested $800 billion, not 800, about $400 billion in the last few years in the Russian extraction industry. And that degree of commitment is only going to grow if we're not there. Second question on war, which could occupy me for a very, very long time. My students used to mistakenly think that great power conflict was a thing of the past, as they read books by people like Steven Pinker and others telling us that a war between China and the United States or Russia and the West was very, very unlikely. And the last time we heard these ideas was back in 1914 by a set of political economists who were telling us that economic interdependence made war impossible. Well, I can tell you from the historical record, which I've studied over 40 years, economic interdependence has never stopped a war. Wars are created by honor, credibility, reputation, the need to maintain it, ambition, excessive, and, of course, the inability to keep means and ends together, setting yourself unrealistic ends and going ahead without the means to be able to achieve them. And that is the situation we're in today. We're still lumbered with those brains our ancestors had 200,000 years ago, which means, yes, we are very rational. We are a species that tries to find what's in our best interests, but as Daniel Kahneman and others have said, we're very stupid. We're not very good at understanding what is in our best interests. And wars are largely caused by not being able to understand what is a rational interest and what's an irrational one.
Thank you very much. I have to go here to Michel Fouché because he was challenged, actually, more or less on whether Europe understands its rational interests in this region.
Okay, 15 years was mentioned as a period of time for negotiation. It was the case for Central Europe and the Baltic states. 15 years. In the past 15 years, EU integrated Croatia and Slovenia and open accession talk with Montenegro and Serbia, which is more than 65-70% of the population of the region. Of course, in Skopje, they can feel frustrated because after the Prespa agreement, they were expecting for reward. They got one from NATO. Sorry, General, but it's much easier to enter NATO than to join the EU, because you enter NATO and after that you change your system. I saw that in the Baltic states. For the EU, you need a long time of preparation. And the other problem is tensions in Bosnia, Kosovo, North Macedonia also. So we are preoccupied with that. But basically about, the slowness of reform. It's very easy to open chapters. It's difficult to close effectively chapters. And the impact of reform, of commitment, in some countries is largely ineffective. There is a gulf between the formal adoption of the laws and the implementation. And maybe this has a link with the political system, what the European Commission called in a report in 2018, the state capture. So there is a work in progress. Once again, I think we should do much more, not only in terms of money, for enhancing the pre-enlargement process, and also to look at reconciliation. This is a key issue. This is completely blocked in Bosnia, as you know. So once again, EU perspective, NATO perspective are slightly different. But maybe because of overestimation of the role of foreign actors, there is a new assertiveness and new consciousness in Brussels, in Paris, also in Berlin, in The Hague, about the fact that Western Balkans should be given much more emphasis than in the past. But there is also in public opinion a kind of enlargement fatigue. You have to understand that. And the migration aspect for Albania, for example, is a problem. How to overpass that? So,
Sorry, thank you. Tony van talked, I think some of the questions, or part of that last question was somehow addressed to you. Rule of law, resilience.
Yes, I see resilience as in a very more comprehensive way indeed. So it has to do with rule of law, strengthening rule of law, strengthening institutions, strengthening independent media, and also, strategic communication. Yes, also resilience against all kind of malign influence, either coming from abroad or being generated in countries themselves. So I have a very broad concept of resilience, and I think this is something the EU could help countries with, and not only by countering disinformation or something like that, but also the other elements like building rule of law, supporting that. I think that is key to the whole region, and that could also only enhance the prospects for joining the European Union in the short or medium term.
Peter Zwack, you wanted to comment.
How many of you out there are aware that what's happening on the 20th of October this year here in Belgrade? Because I think it plays a little bit again into context. if you recall, the Soviets in 1945, 75 years ago, liberated Belgrade from the Nazis. And the point I'm trying to make is there is a long history. That does not justify in any way Moscow trying to interfere with Serbian aspirations, whether the EU or even possibly down the road NATO. But there is a long history that goes back to the region, and more, and I think that plays, if you will, in the popular support that you see, especially out in the countryside, for the Russians. And this goes back historically all the way back to the Ottomans, and the Russians being part of throwing them out of the region as well, and defeating the Austro-Hungarians. So long history there. Chinese, relatively new interlocutors, like really new interlocutors, but they're coming in. They're modern. They understand seams. They have a lot of money to throw around, and so this becomes the challenge to end. I think that the European Union is key in all this. NATO supports that. Yes, from a United States perspective, we go back and forth on economy, which is a major aspect of EU. But on pure security items, I believe that we are lockstep, despite, if you will, sometimes confusing, I think, signals from Washington. We're behind NATO, and we're behind what you are doing here in Serbia, and with our garrison in our forces in Kosovo, and we need to continue to stay. Our last thing, our greatest strength, is our alliances and partners, and we need to be working on that collectively, also us. Thank you.
Thank you. Alexei Kovalev, we started out by thinking of Russia as the main problem and ended up with the European Union being the main problem. What do you think of that?
It's not just me. I'm not saying this because I'm Russian, but I don't really think Russia is the problem here. We would probably like to be to put spokes in some wheels, just to inflate our sense of self-importance, to be a major player. But again, we just don't really have the resources to compete with the major alliances on our own, because we don't really have that many friends to prop us up. We don't have the resources of China or the unity of what is still the European Union. But keep in mind that every failure of the European Union is being played up in Russia in its relations, among others, with Serbia. Like, you can often see that on Russian state television. Like, oh, you see, that's what's happening with this self-inflicted wound that is Brexit. How can you possibly join a union that is crumbling apart in such an undignified manner? Well, it's hard to it's really hard to argue, but from what I'm seeing, I mean, Russia would be a problem if it had to more to offer other than its subsidized gas and access to its relatively small market. Politically, we can't offer much. In terms of ideology, I mean, what we have is pretty syncretic, and it's not really, you can't really export that. So, yeah, I wouldn't think of Russia as a big problem, but you have to keep the aspirations of the personal and kind of sentimental aspirations of the current government in mind, because they are much stronger than any economic arguments. You really can't argue with those, but it also has a shelf life.
Thank you so much. Thank you, panel. I apologize to the audience because we have 0.00000 time left. So we cannot go on and have more questions, but obviously people were really motivated to discuss the things that were on the agenda here. So thank you again. I thought it was interesting. I hope it was interesting for you. And pick up these issues and run with them. Thanks a lot. guys were great.